The most famous find from the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia is the royal cemeteries at Ur. This dates to the early dynastic III period, so it's really late in this consolidation where kings and rulers had really been able to establish their control over the economic systems of Mesopotamia. Now, Woolley's excavations here started in 1922 and ran through 1934, and outside of maybe the finds of something like Howard Carter's tomb of King Tutankhamun, this is one of the most famous archaeological excavations in the world. He found 2,000 early dynastic graves at Ur, including 16 royal tombs. Now, many of them have been looted in antiquity, including the Great Death Pit, with the largest of these tombs. But he did find an intact tomb of one of the queens of Ur at the time, Queen Puabi. And her royal burial kind of matches what we see at the other burial tombs. We have a primary inhumation inside of a mud brick burial chamber within the site. And then outside of the site is a larger pit with a series of earthen ramps. Inside the tomb, we see several attendants are sacrificed with the deceased. We kind of think of these as servants or perhaps slaves who would have worked for the kings at the time. And then outside of the tomb, we see more humans and animal sacrifices that are arranged in rows in these death pits. Tombs themselves, based on Woolley's excavations, contained anywhere between 7 and 80 human sacrifices. But we can also see that this, in addition to the sacrifice, would have been accompanied by an extensive feasting event and music. So we can kind of think of this as the entire city saying goodbye to a ruler through one of these large-scale funerary feasts. But some of the inhabitants would not have left the funerary arrangement. Woolley has argued that they were poisoned, that the feasting vessels were lined with some sort of poison, and then they were arranged by the living after the feast was over. But we do see some of these individuals, human sacrifices, who were simply forced to do so. That is, that they were beaten over the head with a club. So it's not necessarily sure how many people would have willingly, voluntarily went into their death with the ruling class here. Now, the other thing is that they may have drank the poison and not known they were going to be poisoned. So it doesn't mean that they, just because they drank the Kool-Aid, so to say, that they voluntarily signed up for a sacrifice, to be a sacrifice for the royal dynasty. Now, Queen Puabi's tomb is one of the most elaborate ever recovered in the archaeological record. The tomb inside the burial chamber itself, as you can kind of see here in Woolley's drawing, contained tableware made of gold, this feasting equipment made completely of gold. There were dozens of pieces of jewelry, and here you can see the reconstruction of the golden headdress that she was buried in, the huge golden hoop earrings, and then the necklace, the breastplate, the chest plate here of lapis and carnelian and gold and shell and alabaster. So lots of rare resources coming from Afghanistan and the Indian subcontinent and areas around the southern Saudi Arabia and Oman are all being found here inside of her tomb in elaborate craftsmanship. In addition to that, there's a wooden lyre that you can kind of see here, imparting the importance of the musical activities, the festivities. The lyre itself is made out of wood, has stone inlays inside of it, and then it has a head, a golden head with golden lapis lazuli of the bull, the sacred bull of Mesopotamian society. And then on the small carving, the inlay in it, here you can see this individual who's wrestling the bulls of life through this. And then you have the kind of same types of scenes, the importance of that mythological imagery represented most likely in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, in addition to all of the gold and silver, there are also objects, or people included here. 3 personal servants were sacrificed, interred inside the royal burial chamber. And then outside in the area here, the death pit contained 52 sacrificial victims, mostly women, but also 6 men. And the 6 men were soldiers. They were wearing helmets and had spears. There was a chariot with a horse, and multiple chariots and horses and multiple oxen, which you can kind of see here. That's kind of a reconstruction from Woolley's excavations. Here you see the soldiers guarding the entrance to the tomb, the oxen and the servants outside of the royal burial chamber here. So we can kind of think about the enormous investiture of wealth that is going on here. But at the same time, we need to look at the human cost. The idea that life itself was something that could be given to the elite. That the lives of servants and slaves, whoever they were, the royal attendants, belonged to the kings and queens of Mesopotamian society is really a profound look at the social stratification and divisions within society. And we can see this again reflected in another object found in the royal cemetery at Ur. This is the Standard of Ur. This is one of the most famous archaeological finds in the world, and it shows two opposite scenes on either side of a small wooden inlaid box. Now, Woolley argued that this was a standard, a battle standard, something that would have been put on a pole and carried into battle behind the kings of Ur, and that's likely because of the war scene that's depicted here. But archaeologists are still debating what this was for, and most people generally assume that it was a sound box for some kind of musical instrument, a stringed instrument like a lyre or a harp or a guitar. This would have been the sound box inside of it. One side depicts a large feast held by the king and a priest on this side, and the other has an extensive battle. So I want to kind of work through the imagery that we see here, and I want to start with a feast, because I think this gives us a good sense of the stratification of Mesopotamian or early dynastic Ur society. On the bottom, we can see nameless, faceless individuals, all naked, all toiling in the fields or dealing with animals. And they've got the heavy packs as they're marching this into a person who is overseeing this at the end. So we can kind of look at the lower classes of society as they're bringing goods and resources that are being recorded into the temple. And on the second register, we see the same thing. People bringing rams, bulls, sheep, or goats to the temple, and you have this kind of individual on the far right who may be responsible for recording them. And then the top register, we can see how these goods and resources flow upward into society, because here you have the king centered. He's much larger than everyone else. He's wearing an elaborate woolen skirt, and him and his guests are being fed in a large banquet with these golden cups that resemble cups that were found in the tomb of Queen Puabi. And then you have the servants bringing them wine, food, and the dancer with the harp and the musicians over here, showing the kind of scale of a society, how all these goods and resources then flow upward. And then it's the king who redistributes them out, but not to everyone, only to individuals and only in certain contexts, in this sense in a ritual feast. And then on the other register, we see a battle scene. You can kind of almost see the lifelike action here of the chariots as they start in the battle process. They move through. They kind of go from a standstill to a trot to a gallop as they're kind of trampling the enemies of the state. And you have the soldiers on the back of the chariots with their spears and lances mowing people down on the battlefield. And then on the left hand in the middle register, you have the infantry here. All the soldiers are remarkably similar, with a helmet and a cloak. And these helmets and cloaks and daggers and swords that were included here are the same types of things we see found in the soldiers who were buried with Queen Puabi. And then you have the massive battle, and then the subsequent aftermath, where the prisoners of war are naked and bound and being marched back to the capital of Ur. And then in the middle register, you see the king again in the middle with his army behind him, and then the prisoners of war being presented for them, most likely to be incorporated into as slaves into the temple institutions and the kingly institutions, or to be meted out as presents for the elite by the king, as a standard idea here. So we can see the makeup, the orientation, and the importance of that hierarchical system, and the way in which life was structured by it, the way that slaves and farmers and laborers were subjugated by the state, and even those outside of the state who were brought in to incorporate it. Because remember, as Scott says, right, the state is an extractive purpose, and as many people who come into the state, that for every person that comes into the state, there's probably one or two who are fleeing the state because of this, to find their freedom through it. And so the state is constantly at war to gain access to this free labor pool of slaves that they can then extract these economic and agricultural resources from.